Chapter 2. The House and Home of the Man Without Qualities. The street where this little mishap had occurred was one of those long, winding rivers of traffic, radiating outward from the heart of the city to flow through its surrounding districts and empty into the suburbs. Had the distinguished couple followed its course a little longer, they would have come upon a sight that would certainly have pleased them, an old garden, still retaining some of its 18th or even 17th century character, with wrought iron railings through which one could glimpse, in passing, through the trees on a well-clipped lawn, a sort of little chateau with short wings, a hunting lodge or rococo love nest of times past. More specifically, it was basically 17th century, while the park and upper story showed an 18th century influence, and the facade had been restored and somewhat spoiled in the 19th century, so that the whole had something blurred about it, like a double-exposed photograph. But the general effect was such that people invariably stopped and said, "Oh, when this dainty little white gem of a house had its windows open, one could see inside the elegant serenity of a scholar's study with book-lined walls." This dwelling of this house belonged to the man without qualities. He was standing behind a window, gazing through the fine green filter of the garden air to the brownish street beyond, and for the last 10 minutes he had been ticking off on his stopwatch the passing cars, trucks, trolleys, and pedestrians whose faces were washed out by the distance, timing everything, whirling past that could catch in the net of his eye. He was gauging their speeds, their angles, all the living forces of mass hurtling past that drew the eye to follow them like lightning, holding on, letting go, forcing the attention for a split second to resist, to snap, to leap in pursuit of the next item. Then, after doing the arithmetic in his head for a while, he slipped the watch back into his pocket with a laugh and decided to stop all this nonsense. In all those leaps of attention, flexing of eye muscles, fluctuations of the psyche, if all the effort it takes for a man just to hold himself upright within the flow of traffic on a busy street could be measured, he thought, as he toyed with calculating the incalculable, the grand total would surely dwarf the energy needed by Atlas to hold up the world, and one could then estimate the enormous undertaking it is nowadays merely to be a person who does nothing at all. At the moment, the man without qualities was just such a person. To repeat, it would surely, he estimate the enormous task, as he toyed with the calculating the incalculable, the grand total would surely dwarf the energy needed by Atlas to hold up the world, and one could then estimate the enormous undertaking it is nowadays merely to be a person who does nothing at all. At the moment, the man without qualities was just such a person. And what of a man who does do something? And what of a man who does do something? There are two ways to look at it, he decided. A man going quietly about his business all day long expends far more muscular energy than an athlete who lifts a huge weight once a day. This has been proved physiologically. And so the social sum total of everybody's little everyday efforts, especially when added together, doubtless release far more energy into the world than do rare heroic feats. This total even makes the single heroic feat look positively minuscule, like a grain of sand on a mountaintop, with a megalomaniacal sense of its own importance. This thought pleased him. It must be added that it did not please him because he liked a solid middle-class life. On the contrary, he was merely taking a perverse pleasure in thwarting his own inclinations, which had once taken him in quite another direction. What if it is precisely the Philistine who is alive with intimations of a colossally new collective ant-like heroism? It will be called a rationalized heroism, and greatly admired. At this point, who can tell? There were at that time hundreds of such open questions of the greatest importance, hovering in the air and burning underfoot. Time was on the move. People not yet born in those days will find it hard to believe, but even then time was racing along like a cavalry camel, just like today. But nobody knew where time was headed, and it was not always clear what was up or down, what was going forward or backward. No matter what you do, the man without qualities thought with a shrug, within this mare's nest of forces at work, it doesn't make the slightest difference. He turned away like a man who has learned to resign himself, indeed almost like a sick man who shrinks from every strong physical contact. Yet in crossing the adjacent dressing room, he hit a punching bag that was hanging there, a hard, sudden blow that seemed not exactly in keeping with moods of resignation or conditions of weakness. Chapter 3. Even a man without qualities has a father with qualities. When the man without qualities had returned from abroad, some time before, it was a certain exuberance, as well as his loathing for the usual kind of apartment, that led him to rent the little chateau, a former summer house outside the city gates, that had lost its vocation when it was engulfed by the spreading city, and had finally become no more than a run-down, untenanted piece of real estate waiting for its value to go up. The rent was correspondingly low, but to get everything repaired and brought up to modern standards had cost an unexpectedly large sum. It had become an adventure that resulted in driving him to ask his father for help, by no means pleasant for a man who cherished his independence. He was 32, his father 69. The old gentleman was aghast, not really on account of the surprise attack, though that entered into it because he detested rash conduct, nor did he mind the contribution levied on him, as he basically approved of his son's announcing an interest in domesticity and putting his life in order. But to take on a house that had to be called a chateau, even if only in the diminutive, affronted his sense of propriety and worried him as a baleful tempting of fate. He himself had started out as a tutor in the houses of the high aristocracy while still working for his degree, and he had continued tutoring even as a young law clerk, not really from necessity, for his father was quite well off, but those carefully nurtured connections paid off later when he became a university lecturer and a law professor, and they led to his gradually rising to become a legal advisor to almost all the feudal nobility in the country, although by this time he had no need of a professional sideline at all. Even long after the fortune he had made could stand comparison with the dowry brought him by his wife, the daughter of a powerful industrial family in the Rhineland, his son's mother, who had died all too soon. He never allowed these connections, formed in his youth and strengthened in his prime, to lapse. Even after retiring from his practice, except for the occasional special consultation at a high fee, the old scholar who had achieved distinction made a careful catalogue of every event concerning his former circle of former patrons, extended with great precision from fathers to sons to grandsons. No honor, wedding, birthday, or name day passed without a letter of congratulation from him, always a subtle blend of perfectly measured deference and shared reminiscence. He received just as promptly in return brief letters of acknowledgment, which thanked the dear friend and esteemed scholar. So his son was aware from boyhood on of the aristocratic knack for meting out almost unconsciously and with unfailing condensation the exact degree of affability called for, and Ulrich had always been irritated by the subservience of a man who was, after all, a member of the intellectual aristocracy toward the owners of horses, fields, and traditions. If his father was insensitive on this point, it was not because of any calculation. It had been a natural instinct for him to build a great career in this way, so that he became not only a professor and a member of academies and many learned and official committees, but also made a knight and then a commander, the recipient of the Grand Cross of various high orders. His Majesty finally raised him to the hereditary nobility, having already previously named him to membership in the House of Lords. There the distinguished man joined the liberal wing, which sometimes opposed the leading peers. Yet none of his noble patrons seemed to mind or even wonder at this. They had never regarded him as anything but a personified spirit of the rising middle class. The old gentleman participated keenly in the technical work of legislation, and even if controversial issues had him voting on the liberal side, the other side bore him no grudge. Their sense of the matter was, that he had not been invited to join them. What he did in politics was no different from what he had always done: combine his superior knowledge, which sometimes entailed working toward a gentle improvement of conditions, with a demonstration that his personal loyalty was always to be relied upon. So he had risen quite unchanged, as his son maintained, from the role of tutor to the upper middle class, to that of the tutor to the upper house. When he learned about his son's acquisition of the chateau, it struck him as a transgression against limits all the more sacred for not being legally defined, and he rebuked his son even more bitterly than on the many previous occasions he had found it necessary to do so, almost in terms of prophesying a bad end, of which this purchase was the beginning. The basic premise of his life was affronted. As with many men who achieve distinction, this feeling was far from self-serving, but consisted of a deep love of the general good above personal advantage. In other words, he sincerely venerated the state of affairs that had served him so well, not because it was to his advantage, but because he was in harmony and coexistent with it, and on general principles. This is a point of great importance. Even a pedigreed dog searches out his place under the dining table regardless of kicks, not because of canine objection, but out of loyalty and faith. And even coldly calculating people do not succeed half so well in life as those with properly blended temperaments who are capable of deep feeling for those persons and conditions that happen to serve their own interests. Chapter 4. If there is a sense of reality, there must also be a sense of possibility. To pass freely through open doors, it is necessary to respect the fact that they have solid frames. This principle, by which the old professor had always lived, is simply a requisite of the sense of reality. But if there is a sense of reality, and no one will find out that it has justification for existing, then there must also be something we can call a sense of possibility. Chapter 4. If there is a sense of reality, there must also be a sense of possibility. To pass freely through open doors, it is necessary to respect the fact that they have solid frames. This principle, by which the old professor had always lived, is simply a requisite of the sense of reality. But if there is a sense of reality, and no one will doubt that it has its justification for existing, then there must also be something we can call a sense of possibility. Whoever has it does not say, for instance, here this or that has happened, will happen, must happen, but he invents. Here this or that might, could, or ought to happen. If he is told that something is the way it is, he will think, well, it could probably just as well be otherwise. So the sense of possibility could be defined outright as the ability to conceive of everything there might be just as well, and to attach no more importance to what is than to what is not. The consequences of so creative a disposition can be remarkable, and may, regrettably, often make what people admire seem wrong, and what is taboo permissible, or also make both a matter of indifference. Such possibilists are said to inhabit more delicate medium, a hazy medium of mist, fantasy, daydreams, and the subjunctive mood. Children who show this tendency are dealt with firmly and warned that such persons are cranks, dreamers, weaklings, know-it-alls, or troublemakers. Such fools are also called idealists by those who wish to praise them, but all this clearly applies only to their weak subspecies, those who cannot comprehend reality, or who, in their melancholic condition, avoid it. These are people in whom the lack of sense of reality is a real deficiency, but the possibility includes not only the fantasies of people with weak nerves, but also the as yet unawakened intentions of God. A possible experience or truth is not the same as an actual experience or truth minus its reality value, but has, according to its partisans at least, something quite divine about it, a fire, a soaring, a readiness to build, and a conscious utopianism that does not shrink from reality but sees it as a project, something yet to be invented. After all, the earth is not that old and was apparently never so ready as now to give birth to its full potential. To try to readily distinguish the realists from the possibilists, just think of a specific sum of money. Whatever possibilities inhere in, say $1,000, are surely there independently of their belonging or not belonging to someone. That the money belongs to a Mr. Me or a Mr. Thee adds no more to it than would a rose or a woman. But a fool will tuck the money away in a sack, say the realists, while a capable man will make it work for him. Even the beauty of a woman is undeniably enhanced or diminished by the man who possesses her. It is reality that awakens possibilities, and nothing would be more perverse than to deny it. Even so, it will always be the same possibilities, in sum or on the average, that go on repeating themselves until a man comes along who does not value the actuality above the idea. It is he who first gives the new possibilities their meaning, their direction, and he awakens them. But such a man is far from being a simple proposition, since his ideas to the extent that they are not idle fantasies are nothing but realities as yet unborn. He too naturally has a sense of reality, but it is a sense of possible reality, and arrives at its goals much more slowly than most people's sense of their real possibilities. He wants the forest, as it were, and the others the trees. And forest is hard to define, while trees represent so many cords of wood of a definable quality. Putting it another and perhaps better way, the man with an ordinary sense of reality is like a fish that nibbles at the hook but is unaware of the line, while the man with the sense of reality, which can also be called a sense of possibility, trawls a line through the water and has no idea whether there's any bait on it. His extraordinary indifference to the life snapping at the bait is marked by the risk he runs of doing utterly eccentric things. An impractical man, which he not only seems to be, but really is, will always be unreliable and unpredictable in his dealings with others. He will engage in actions that mean something else to him than others, but he is at peace with himself about everything as long as he can make it all come together in a fine idea. Today, he is still far from being consistent. He is quite capable of regarding a crime that brings harm to another person merely as a lapse to be blamed not on the criminal, but on the society that produced the criminal. But it remains doubtful whether he would accept a slap in the face with the same detachment, or take it impersonally as one takes the bite of a dog. The chances are that he would first hit back, and then on reflection decide that he shouldn't have. Moreover, if someone were to take away his beloved, it is most unlikely that he would today be quite ready to discount the reality of his loss and find compensation in some surprising new reaction. At present, this development still has some way to go and affects the individual person as a weakness as much as a strength. Since the possession of qualities assumes a certain pleasure in their reality, we can see how a man who cannot summon up a sense of reality even in relation to himself may suddenly one day come to see himself as a man without qualities. The man without qualities whose story is being told here was called Ulrich, and Ulrich, his family name must be suppressed out of consideration for his father, had already given proof of his disposition, while still on the borderline between childhood and adolescence, in a class paper on a patriotic theme. Patriotism in Austria was quite a special subject. German children simply learned to despise the war sacred to Austrian children, and were taught to believe that French children, whose forebears were all decadent lechers, would turn tail by the thousands at the approach of the German soldier with a big beard. Exactly the same ideas, with roles reversed, and other desirable adjustments were taught to French, English, and Russian children, who also had been on the winning side. Children are, of course, show-offs, love to play cops and robbers, and are naturally inclined to regard the X family on Y Street as the greatest family in the world if it happens to be their own. So patriotism comes easily to children, but in Austria the situation was slightly more complicated. For although the Austrians had of course also won all the wars in their history, after most of them they had to give up something up. They've had to give something up. This was food for thought, and Ulrich wrote in his essay on love of country that anyone who really loved his country must never regard it as the best country in the world. Then, in a flash of inspiration that seemed to him especially fine, although he was more dazzled by its splendor than he was clear about its implications, he added to this dubious statement a second, that God himself probably preferred to speak of his world in the subjunctive of possibility. Hic dicerex quispiam. Here someone might object that, for God creates the world and thinks while he is at it that it could just as well be done differently. That God himself probably preferred to speak. In a dubious statement, the second, that God himself probably preferred to speak of his world in the subjunctive of possibility, for God creates the world and thinks while he is at it that it could just as well be done differently. Ulrich glorified in this sentence, but he must not have expressed himself clearly enough because it caused a great uproar and nearly got him expelled from school, although nothing happened because the authorities could not make up their minds whether to regard his brazen remark as calumny against the fatherland or as blasphemy against God. At the time, he was attending the Teresianum, that select school for the sons of the aristocracy and gentry that supplied the noblest pillars of the state. At the same time, he was attending the Teresianum, the school that selects for this that select school, the Teresianum, that school for the sons of the aristocracy and gentry that supplied the noblest pillars of the state. His father, furious at the humiliation brought upon him by this unrecognizable chiff off the old block, packed him off abroad to a Belgian town nobody had ever heard of, where a small, inexpensive private school run on shrewd and efficient business lines did a roaring trade in black sheep. There, Ulrich learned to give his disdain for other people's ideals international scope. Since that time, 16 or 17 years had passed, as the clouds drift across the sky. Ulrich neither regretted them nor was proud of them. He simply looked back at them in his 32nd year with astonishment. He had meanwhile been here and there, including brief spells at home, and engaged in this or that worthwhile or futile endeavor. It had already been mentioned that he was a mathematician, and nothing more need be said of that for the moment. In every profession, followed not for the money but for love, there comes a moment when the advancing years seem to lead to a void. After this moment had lasted for some time, Ulrich remembered that a man's native country is supposed to have the mysterious power of making the mind take root and thrive in its true soil, and so he settled there with the feeling of a hiker who sits down on a bench for eternity, but with the thought that he will be getting up again immediately. When he set about putting his house in order, as the Bible has it, it turned out to be the experience he had actually been waiting for. He had got himself into the pleasant position of having to restore his run-down little property from scratch. He was free to follow any principle from the stylistically pure to the totally reckless, free to choose any style from the Assyrians to Cubism. What should he choose? Modern man is born in a hospital and dies in a hospital, so he should make his home like a clinic. So claimed a leading architect for the moment. And another reformer of interior decoration advocated movable partitions in homes instead of fixed walls, so that people would learn to trust their housemates instead of shutting themselves off from one another. Time was making a fresh start just then. It does so all the time, and new time needs a new style. Luckily for Ulrich, the little chateau already had 3 styles superimposed on one another, setting limits on what he could do to meet all those new demands. Yet he felt quite shaken by the responsibility of having the opportunity to renovate a house, what with the threat hovering over his head, quote, "Show me how you live and I will tell you who you are," which he had read repeatedly in art magazines. After intensive study of these periodicals, he decided that he had best take the extension of his personality into his own hands and began to design his future furniture himself. But no sooner had he come up with an impressively massive form than it occurred to him that something spare and strictly functional could just as easily be put in its place. And when he had stretched a form of reinforced concrete that looked emaciated by its own strength, he was reminded of the thin vernal lines of a 13-year-old girl's body and drifted off into a reverie instead of making up his mind. He was in that familiar state, not that that occasion mattered too seriously to him, of incoherent ideas spreading outward without a center, so characterized of the present, and whose strange arithmetic adds up to a random proliferation of numbers without forming a unit. Finally, he dreamed up only impractical rooms, revolving rooms, kaleidoscope interiors, adjustable scenery for the soul, and his ideas grew steadily more devoid of content. He had now finally reached the point to which he had been drawn all along. His father would have put it something like this: give a fellow a totally free hand, and he will soon run his head into a wall out of sheer confusion. Or this: a man who can have anything he wants will soon be at a loss as to what to wish for. Ulrich repeated these sayings to himself with great enjoyment. Their hoary wisdom appeared to him as an extraordinary new thought. For a man's possibilities, plans, and feelings must first be hedged in by prejudices, traditions, obstacles, and barriers of all sorts, like a lunatic in his straitjacket, and only then can whatever he is capable of doing have perhaps some value, substance, and staying power. Here, in fact, was an idea with incalculable implications. Now the man without qualities, who had come back to his own country, took the second step toward letting himself be shaped by the outward circumstances of life. At this point in his deliberations, he simply left the furnishings of his house to the genius of his suppliers, secure in the knowledge that he could safely leave the traditions, prejudices, and limitations to them. All he did himself was to touch up the earlier lines, the dark antlers under the white vaultings of the little hall, the formal ceiling in the salon, and whatever else that seemed to him useful and convenient. When it was all done, he could shake his head and wonder, is this the life that is going to be mine? What he possessed was a charming little palace. One must almost call it that because it was exactly the way one imagined such places. A tasteful residence for a resident as conceived by furniture dealers, carpet sellers, and interior decorators who were leaders in their fields. All that was missing was for this charming clockwork to be wound up, for then carriages bringing high dignitaries and noble ladies would come rolling up the driveway, and footmen would leap from their running boards to ask, looking Ulrich over dubiously, "Where is your master, my good man?" He had returned from the moon and had promptly installed himself on the moon again. Leona, or a change in viewpoint. Once a man has put his house in order, it is time to go a-courting. Ulrich's girlfriend in those days was a chanteuse in a small cabaret who went by the name of Leontine. She was tall, curvaceously slender, provocatively lifeless, and he called her Leona. He had been struck by the moist darkness of her eyes, the dolefully passionate expression on her handsome, regular, long face, and the songs full of feeling that sang instead of risque ones. All these old-fashioned little songs were about love, sorrow, abandonment, faithfulness, forest murmurs, and shining trout. She stood tall and lonely to the marrow on the tiny stage and patiently sang at the public with a housewife's voice, and even if something suggestive did slip in now and then, the effect was all the more ghost-like because she spelled out all the feelings of the heart, the tragic as well as the teasing, with the same wooden gestures. Ulrich was immediately reminded of old photographs or engravings of dated beauties in ancient issues of forgotten women's magazines. As he thought himself into this woman's face, he saw in it a large number of small traits that simply could not be real, yet they made the face what it was. There are, of course, in all periods and all kinds of countenances, but only one type will be singled out by a period's taste as its ideal image of happiness and beauty, while all the other faces do their best to copy it. And with the help of fashion and hairdressers, even the ugly ones manage to approximate the ideal. But there are some faces that never succeed, faces born to a strange distinction of their own, unyielding, expressing the regal and banished ideal beauty of an earlier period. Such faces wander about like corpses of past desires in a great void of life's traffic, and the men who gaped into the vast tedium of Leontine's singing, unaware of what was happening to them, felt their nostrils twitch with feelings quite different from those aroused by brazen petite chanteuses with tango spit curls. So Ulrich decided to call her Leona and desired to possess her, as he might have wanted to possess a luxurious lion-skin rug. And so Ulrich decided to call her Leona, and desired to possess her as he might have wanted to possess a luxurious lion-skin rug. But after their acquaintance had begun, Leona developed another anachronistic quality. She was an incredible glutton, and this is a vice whose heyday had passed a very long time ago. Its origin was in the craving she had suffered as a poor child for rich, costly delicacies. Now finally liberated, it had the force of an ideal that has broken out of its cage and seized power. Her father had apparently been a respectable little man who beat her every time she went out with admirers, but she did it only because there was nothing she liked better than to sit on one of those sidewalk tables in front of the little pastry shop, spooning up her sherbet while genteelly watching the passing parade. It could not be maintained that she took no interest in sex, but it could be said that she was in this respect, as in every other, downright lazy and hated to work. In her ample body, every stimulus took an astonishing long time to reach the brain, and it happened that her eyes began to glaze over for no apparent reason in mid-afternoon, although the night before she had been fixed on a point of the ceiling as though she were observing a fly. Or else in the midst of a complete silence she might begin to laugh at a joke she just now understood, having listened to it days ago without any sign of understanding it. When she had no particular reason to be otherwise, she was completely ladylike. She could never be made to tell how she had gotten into her line of work in the first place. She apparently did not quite remember this herself, but it was clear that she regarded the work of a cabaret singer as a necessary part of life, bound up with everything she had ever heard about greatness in art and artists, so that it seemed to her altogether right, uplifting, and refined to step out every evening onto a tiny stage enveloped in billowing cigar haze to sing songs known for their heart-rending appeal. If things needed livening up a bit, she did not, of course, shrink from slipping in something gamey now and then, but she was quite sure that the prima donna of the Imperial Opera did exactly the same. Of course, if the art of trading for money was not the entire person, as usual, but only the body must be called prostitution, then Leona occasionally engaged in prostitution. But if you have lived for 9 years, as she had from the age of 16, on the miserable pay of the lowest dives, with your head full of the prices of costumes and underwear, the deductions, greediness, and caprices of the owners, the commissions on the food and drink, and the patrons warming up to their fun, and the price of a room in the nearby hotel day after day, including the fights and the business calculations, then everything the layman enjoys as a night on the town adds up to a profession full of its own logic, objectivity, and class codes. Prostitution, especially, is a matter in which it makes all the difference whether you see it from above or from below. But even though Leona's attitude towards sexual questions was completely businesslike, she had a romantic side as well. Only with her, everything high flown, vain, and extravagant. All her feelings of pride, envy, lust, ambition, and self-abandonment, in short, the driving force of her personality and upward social mobility, were anchored by some freak of nature, not in the so-called heart, but in the gut, the eating process, which in fact were regularly associated in earlier times and still are today, as can be seen among primitives and the carousing peasantry, who manage to express social standing and all sorts of other human distinctions at their ritual feasts by overeating, and with all the side effects. At the tables in the honky-tonk where she worked, Leona did her job, but what she dreamed of was a cavalier who would sweep her away from all this by means of an affair as long as one of her engagements, and allow her to sit grandly in the grand restaurant studying a grand menu. She would then have preferred to eat anything on the menu at once, yet the pain of having to choose was sweetened by the satisfaction of having a chance to show that she knew how one had to choose, how one put together an exquisite repast. Only in the choice of desserts could she let herself go, so that reversing the usual order, she ended up turning dessert into an extensive second supper. With black coffee and stimulating quantities of drink, Leona restored her capacities, then egged herself on through a sequence of special treats until her passion was finally quenched. Her body was now so stuffed with choice concoctions that it was ready to split at the seams. Then she looked around in indolent triumph, and though never talkative, enjoyed reminiscing about the expensive delights she had consumed. She would speak of a palome à la Torlonia or pomme à la Melville with the studied casualness with which people effectively let drop the name of a prince or a lord of the same name they have met. Because the public appearances with Leona were not exactly to Ulrich's taste, he usually moved her feedings to his house, with the antlers and stylish furniture for an audience. Here, however, she felt cheated of her social satisfaction, and whenever the man without qualities tempted her to these private excesses with her choicest fare, even supplied by a restaurant chef, she felt ill-used, exactly like a woman who realizes that she's not being loved for her soul. She was a beauty, she was a singer, she had no reason to hide, as several dozen men she aroused every evening would have testified. Yet this man, although he wanted to be alone with her, would not even give her the satisfaction of moaning, "Leona, you devil, your ass is driving me crazy," and licking his mustache with desire when he so much as looked at her, and she was accustomed to expect from her gallants. Although she stuck to him faithfully, Leona despised him a bit, and Ulrich knew it. He also knew well what was expected of him, but the days when he could have brought himself to say such things and still had a mustache were too long gone. To be no longer able to do something one used to be able to do, no matter how foolish it was, is exactly as if apoplexy had struck an arm and a leg. His eyeballs twitched when he looked at her after food and drink had gone to her head. Her beauty could be gently lifted off her. It was the beauty of that Duchess whom Scheffel St. Eccles had carried over the convent's threshold, the beauty of the great lady with the falcon on her glove, the beauty of the legendary Empress Elizabeth of Austria, with her heavy crown of braids, delight for people who were all dead. And to put it precisely, she also brought to mind the divine Juno, not the eternal and imperishable goddess herself, but the quality that a vanished or vanishing era called Juno-esque. Thus was the dream of life only loosely draped over its substance. But Leona knew that such elegant entertainment entitled the host to something more than a guest who was merely there to be gaped at. Even when he asked for nothing more, she rose to her feet and, as soon as she was able, and serenely broke into full-throated song. Her friend regarded such an evening as a ripped-out page, alive with all sorts of suggestions and ideas, but mummified, like everything torn from its context, full of the tyranny of that eternally fixed stance that accounts for the uncanny fascination of tableaux vivants, as though life had suddenly been given a sleeping pill and was now standing there stiff, full of inner meaning, sharply outlined, and yet in some making absolutely no sense at all. Chapter 7. In a weak moment, Ulrich acquires a new mistress. One morning, Ulrich came home looking a mess. His clothes hung in shreds. He had to wrap his bruised head in a cold towel. His watch and wallet were gone. He had no idea whether he had been robbed by the three men whom he had got into a fight, or whether a passing Samaritan had quietly lifted them while he lay unconscious on the pavement. He went to bed, and while his battered limbs, tenderly borne up and enveloped, were restored to being, he mulled over his adventure once more. The three heads had suddenly loomed up in front of him. Perhaps he had brushed up against one of the men at that late, lonely hour, for his thoughts had been wandering, but these faces were already set in anger and moved scowling in the circle of the lamplight. At that point he made a mistake. He should have instantly recoiled as if in fear, backing hard into the fellow who had stepped into him, or jabbing his elbow into his stomach and tried to escape. He could not take on three strong single-handed. He could not take on three strong men single-handed. He resisted the idea that the three faces suddenly glaring at him out of the night with rage and scorn were simply after his money, but chose to see them as a spontaneous materialization of free-floating hostility. Even as the hooligans were cursing at him, he toyed with the notion that they might not perhaps be hooligans at all, but citizens like himself, only slightly tipsy and freed of their inhibitions, whose attention had fastened on his passing form, and who now discharged on him the hatred that is always ready and waiting for him or for any stranger, like a thunderstorm in the atmosphere. There were times when he felt something of the sort himself. Regrettably, a great many people nowadays feel antagonistic toward a great many other people. It is a basic trait of civilization that man deeply mistrusts those who are outside his own circle. So it is not only the Teuton who looks down on the Jew, but also the soccer player who regards the pianist as an incomprehensible. It is not only the Teuton who looks down on the Jew, but also the soccer player who regards the pianist as an incomprehensible and inferior creature. Ultimately, a thing exists only by virtue of its boundaries, which means by a more or less hostile act against its surroundings. Without the Pope, there would have been no Luther, and without the pagans, no Pope. So there is no getting away from the fact that man's deepest social instinct is his antisocial instinct. Not that Ulrich thought this out in such detail, but he knew that this condition of vague atmospheric hostility with which the air of our era is charged, and when it suddenly comes to a head in the form of three strangers who lash out like thunder and lightning, and then afterward vanish again forever, it is almost a relief. In any case, facing three such louts, he apparently indulged in too much thinking, for although the first one who jumped him, and anticipated by Ulrich with a blow on the chin, went flying back, the second, who should have been felled in a flash immediately afterward, was only grazed by Ulrich's fist because a blow from behind with a heavy object had nearly cracked Ulrich's skull. Ulrich's knees buckled, and he felt a hand grabbing at him, recovering with that almost unnatural lucidity of body that usually follows an initial collapse. He struck out at the tangle of strange bodies, but was hammered down by fists growing larger all the time. Satisfied with his analysis of what had gone wrong as primarily an athlete's slip-up, anyone can jump too short on occasion, Ulrich, whose nerves were still in excellent shape, quietly fell asleep with precisely the same delight in the descending spirals of fading consciousness that he had dimly felt during his defeat. When he woke up again, he checked to make sure he had not been seriously hurt and considered his experience once again. A brawl always leaves a bad taste in the mouth, that of an over-hasty intimacy, as it were. And leaving aside the fact that he had been the one attacked, Ulrich somehow felt that he had behaved improperly. But in what way? Close by those streets where there is a policeman every 300 paces to avenge the slightest offense against law and order, lie other streets that call for the same strength of body and mind as a jungle. Mankind produces Bibles and guns, tuberculosis and tuberculin. It is democratic with kings and nobles, builds churches and against the churches, universities. It is democratic, but with kings and nobles, builds churches and against the churches, universities, turns cloisters into barracks, but assigns field chaplains to the barracks. It naturally arms hoodlums with lead-filled rubber truncheons to beat a fellow man within an inch of his life, and then provides feather beds for the lonely, mistreated body, like the one now holding Ulrich, as if filled with respect and consideration. It is the old story of contradictions, the inconsistency, and the imperfection of life. It makes us smile or sigh, but not Ulrich. He hated this mixture of resignation and infatuation in regard to life that make most people put up with its inconsistencies and inadequacies, as a doting maid aunt puts up with a young nephew's boorishness. Still, he did not immediately leap out of bed. when it looked as though he were profiting from the disorderliness of human affairs by lingering there, because in many ways it is only a premature compromise with one's conscience at the expense of the general cause, a short circuit, an evasion into the private sphere when one avoids doing wrong and does the right thing for one's own person instead of working to restore the order in the whole scheme of things. In fact, after his involuntary experience, Ulrich saw desperately little value in doing away with guns here, with monarchs there, in making some lesser or greater progress in cutting down on stupidity and viciousness, since the measure of all that is nasty and bad instantly fills up again, as if one leg of the world always slips back when the other pushes forward. One had to find the cause of this, the secret mechanism behind it. How incomparably more important that would be than merely being a good person in accordance with obsolescent moral principles. And so, in matters of morality, Ulrich was attracted more to service on the general staff than to the everyday heroism of doing good. At this point, he went back in his mind to the sequel of last night's adventure. As he regained his senses from the beating he had suffered, a cab stopped at the curve. The driver tried to lift up the wounded stranger by the shoulders, and the lady was bending over him with an angelic expression on her face. This child's picture book vision, natural to moments of consciousness rising from the depths, soon gave way to reality. The presence of a woman busying herself with him had the effect on Ulrich of a whiff of cologne, superficial and quickening, so that he also instantly knew that he had not been too badly damaged, and tried to rise to his feet with good grace. In this he did not succeed as smoothly as he would have liked, and the lady anxiously offered to drive him somewhere to get help. Ulrich asked to be taken home, and as he really still looked dazed and helpless, she granted his request. Once inside the cab, he quickly recovered his poise. He felt something maternally sensuous beside him, a fine cloud of solicitous idealism, in the warmth of which tiny crystals of doubt were already hatching, filling the air like softly falling snow, and generating the fear of some impulsive act. He had felt himself becoming a man again. He told his story, and the beautiful woman, only slightly younger than himself, around 30 perhaps, lamented what brutes people were, and felt terribly sorry for him. Of course, he now launched into a lively defense of his experience, which was not, as he explained to the surprised motherly beauty, to be judged solely by its outcome. The fascination of such a fight, he said, was the rare chance it offered in civilian life to perform so many vigorously, yet precisely coordinated movements in response to barely perceptible signals at a speed that made conscious control quite impossible, which is why, as every athlete knows, training must stop several days before a contest, for no other reason than that the muscles and nerves must be given time to work out the final coordination among themselves, leaving the will, purpose, and consciousness out of it, and without any say in the matter. Then, at the moment of action, Ulrich went on. Muscles and nerves leap and fence with the quote, I, but this, quote, I, the whole body, the soul, the will, the central and entire person, as legally distinguished from all others, is swept along by his muscles and nerves, like Europa riding the bull. Whenever it does not work out this way, if by some unlucky chance the merest ray of reflection hits this darkness, the whole effort is invariably doomed. Ulrich had talked himself into a state of excitement. Basically, he now maintained, this experience of almost total ecstasy or transcendence of the conscious mind is akin to experiences now lost but known in the past to the mystics of all religions, which makes it a kind of contemporary substitution for an eternal human need. Even if it is not a very good substitute, it is better than nothing, and boxing or similar kinds of sport that organize this principle into a rational system are therefore a species of theology, although one cannot expect this to be generally understood as yet. Ulrich's lively speech to his companion was probably inspired, in part by vanity, to make her forget the sorry state in which she had found him. Under these circumstances, it was hard for her to tell whether he was being serious or sardonic. In any case, it might have seemed quite natural, perhaps even interesting, to her that he should try to explain theology in terms of sport, since sport is a timely topic while nobody really knows anything about theology, although there were undeniably still a great many churches around. All in all, she decided that by some lucky chance she had come to the rescue of a brilliant man, even though she did wonder, between whiles, whether he might have suffered a concussion. Ulrich, who now wanted to say something comprehensible, took the opportunity to point out in passing that Even love must be regarded as one of the religious and dangerous experiences because it lifts people out of the arms of reason and sets them afloat with no ground under their feet. True enough, the lady said, but sports are so rough. So they are, Ulrich hastened to concur. Sports are rough. One could say that they are precipitations of a most finely dispersed general hostility, which is deflected into athletic games. Of course, one could also say the opposite. Sports bring people together, promote team spirit, and all that, which basically proves only the brutality and love are no farther apart than one wing of a big, colorful, silent bird is from the other, as one wing of a big, silent, colorful bird is from the other wing. He had put the emphasis on the wings and on the bright, mute bird, a notion that did not make much sense, but was charged with some of the vast sensuality with which life simultaneously satisfies all the rival contradictions in its measureless body. He now noticed that his neighbor had no idea what he was talking about, and that the soft snowfall she was diffusing inside the cab had grown thicker. So he turned to face her completely. So he turned to face her completely and asked whether she was perhaps repelled by such talk of physical matters. The doings of the body, he went on, were really too much in fashion, and they included a feeling of horror, because a body in perfect training has the upper hand. It responds automatically in its finely tuned ways to every stimulus, so surely that its owner is left with an uncanny sensation of having to watch helplessly as his character runs off with some part of his anatomy, as it were. It indeed seems that this question touched the young woman deeply. She appeared excited by his words, was breathing hard, and cautiously moved away a little. A mechanism similar to the one he had just described, heavy breathing, a flushed skin, a strong beating of the heart, and perhaps some other symptoms as well, seemed to have been set off inside her. But just then the cab stopped at Ulrich's gate, and there was only time for him to ask, with a smile, for his rescuer's address, so that he could thank her properly. To his astonishment, this favor was not granted, and so the black-wrought iron gate banged shut behind a baffled stranger. What she presumably saw were the trees of an old park rising tall and dark in the light of the electric street lights and lamps going on in the windows, and the low wings of a boudoir-like dainty little chateau spreading out on a well-shorn emerald lawn, and a glimpse of an interior hung with pictures and lined with colorful bookshelves, as her erstwhile companion disappeared into an unexpectedly delightful setting. So concluded the events of last night, and as Ulrich was still thinking how unpleasant it would have been if he had had to spend more time on yet another of those love affairs he had long since grown tired of, a lady was announced who would not give her name, and who now entered his room heavily veiled. It was she herself, who had not wanted to give him her name and address, but had now come in person to carry on the adventure of a romantically charitable fashion on the pretext of being concerned about his health. 2 weeks later, Bonadea had been his mistress for 14 days. Chapter 8, Cacania. At the age when one still attaches great importance to everything connected with tailors and barbers, and enjoys looking in the mirror, one also imagines a place where one would like to spend one's life, or at least where it would be smart to stay even if one did not care for it too much personally. For some time now, such an obsessive daydream has been a kind of super-American city where everyone rushes about or stands still with a stopwatch in hand. Air and earth form an ant-hill traversed, level upon level by roads with traffic, air trains, ground trains, underground trains, people mailed through tubes, special deliveries, and chains of cars race along horizontally, while express elevators pump masses of people vertically from one traffic level to another. At the junctions, people leap from one vehicle to the next, instantly sucked in and snatched away by the rhythm of it, which makes a syncope, a pause, a little gap of 20 seconds, during which a word might be hastily exchanged with someone else. Questions and answers synchronize like meshing gears. Everyone has only certain fixed tasks to do. Professions are located in special areas and organized by group. Meals are taken on the run. Other parts of the city are centers of entertainment, while still others contain the towers where one finds wife, family, phonograph, and soul. Tension and relaxation, activity and love are precisely timed and weighed on the basis of exhaustive laboratory studies. If anything goes wrong in any of these activities, the whole thing is simply dropped. Something else, or sometimes a better way, will be found, or someone else will find the way one has missed. There's nothing wrong with that, while on the other hand, nothing is so wasteful of the social energies as the presumption that an individual is called upon to cling for all he is worth to some specific personal goal. In a community coursed through by energies, every road leads to a worthwhile goal provided one doesn't hesitate or reflect too long. Targets are short-term, but since life is too short, results are maximized, which is all people need to be happy, because the soul is formed by what you accomplish, whereas what you desire without achieving, it merely warps the soul. Targets are short-term, but life is short too. Results are maximized, which is all people need to be happy, because the soul is formed by what you accomplish, whereas what you desire without achieving, it merely warps the soul. Happiness depends very little on what we want, but only on achieving whatever it is that is achieved. Besides, zoology teaches that a number of flawed individuals can add up to a brilliant social unit. It is by no means certain that this is the way it has to be, but such ideas belong to those travel fantasies reflecting our sense of incessant movement that carries us along. These fantasies are superficial, restless, and brief. God knows what will really happen. Presumably, it is up to us to make a new start of any given moment and come up with a plan for us all. If all that high-speed business doesn't suit us, let's do something else. For instance, something quite slow-moving with a veiled, billowing, sea slug-like mysterious happiness, and the deep, cow-eyed gaze the ancient Greeks admired. But that is not how it really is. We are at the mercy of our condition. We travel in it day and night, doing whatever else we do, shaving, eating, making love, reading books, working at our jobs, as though those four walls around us were standing still. But the uncanny fact is that those walls are moving along without our noticing it, casting their rails ahead like long, groping, twisted antennae. Going, we don't know where. Besides, we would like to think of ourselves as having a hand in making our time what it is. It is very uncertain. It is a very uncertain part to play, and sometimes looking out the window after a fairly long pause, we find that the landscape has changed. What flies past, it can't be helped. But with all our devotion to our role, an uneasy feeling grows in us that we have traveled past our goal or got on the wrong track. Then one day the violent need is there. Get off the train, jump, clear, a homesickness, a longing to be stopped, to cease evolving, to stay put, to return to the point before the thrown switch put us on the wrong track. And in the good old days, when the Austrian Empire still existed, one could in such a case get off the train of time, get on an ordinary train of an ordinary railroad, and then travel back to one's home. There in Caconia, that state since vanished that no one understood. In Caconia, that state vanished that no one understood, in many ways an exemplary state, though unappreciated. There was a tempo too, but not too much tempo. Whenever one thought of that country from some place abroad, the memory that hovered before one's eyes was of white, wide, prosperous-looking roads dating from the era of foot marches and mail coaches, roads that crisscrossed the country in every direction like the rivers of order, like ribbons of bright military twill, the paper-white arms of administration holding all the provinces in its embrace. And what provinces they were! Glaciers and sea, karst, limestone, and Bohemian fields of grain, nights on the Adriatic chirping with restless cicadas, and Slovakian villages where the smoke rose from chimneys as from upturned nostrils, while the village cowered between two small hills as if the earth had parted its lips to warm its child between them. Of course, cars rolled on these roads too, but not too many. The conquest of the air was being prepared here too, but not too intensively. A ship would now and then be sent off to South America or East Asia, but not too often. There was no ambition for world markets or world power. Here at the very center of Europe, where the world's old axes crossed, words such as colony and overseas sounded like something quite untried and remote. There was some show of luxury, but by no means as in such over-refined ways as the French. People went in for sports, but not as fanatically as the English. Ruinous sums of money were spent on the army, but only just enough to secure its position as the second weakest among the great powers. The capital, too, was somewhat smaller than all the other biggest cities of the world, but considerably bigger than a mere big city. And the country's administration was conducted in an enlightened, unobtrusive manner, with all the sharp edges cautiously smoothed over by the best bureaucracy in Europe, which could be faulted only in that it regarded genius and any brilliant individual initiative not backed by noble birth or official status as insolent and presumptuous. But then, who welcomes interference from unqualified outsiders? And in Caconia, at least, it would only happen that a genius would be regarded as a lout, but never was a mere lout taken, as happens elsewhere, for a genius. All in all, how many amazing things might be said about the vanished Caconia. Everything and every person in it, for instance, bore the label Kaiserlich Königlich, Imperial Royal, or Kaiserlich und Königlich, Imperial and Royal, abbreviated as KK or K and K. But to be sure, which institutions and which persons were to be designated by KK and which K and K required the mastery of a secret science. On paper, it was called Austrian-Hungarian Monarchy, but in conversation it was called Austria, a name solemnly abjured officially while stubbornly retained emotionally, just to show that feelings are quite as important as constitutional law, and that regulations are one thing, but real life is something else entirely. Liberal in its constitution, it was administered clerically. The government was clerical, but everyday life was liberal. All citizens were equal before the law, but not everyone was a citizen. There was a parliament which asserted its freedom so forcefully that it was usually kept shut. There was also an Emergency Powers Act that enabled the government to get along without parliament, but then everyone had happily settled for absolutism. The Crown decreed that it was time to go back to parliamentary rule. The country was full of such goings-ons, among them the sort of nationalist movements that rightly attracted so much attention in Europe and are so thoroughly misunderstood today. They were so violent that they jammed the machinery of government and brought it to a dead stop several times a year, but in the intervals and during the deadlocks, people got along perfectly well and acted as if nothing had happened. And in fact, nothing really had happened. It was only that everyone's natural resentment of everyone else's effort to get ahead, a resentment we all feel nowadays, had crystallized earlier in Caconia, where it can be said to have assumed the form of a sublimated ceremonial rite, which could have had a great future had its development not been cut prematurely short by a catastrophe. For it was not only the resentment of one's fellow citizens that had become intensified there into a strong sense of community. Even the lack of faith in oneself and one's own fate took on the character of a deep self-certainty. In this country one acted, sometimes to the highest degree of passion and its consequences, differently from the way one thought, or one thought differently from the way one acted. Uninitiated observers have mistaken this for charm, or even for a weakness of what they thought to be the Austrian character, but they were wrong. It is always wrong to explain what happens in a country by the character of its inhabitants. For the inhabitant of a country has at least 9 characters: professional, national, civic, class, geographic, sexual, conscious, unconscious, and possibly even a private character to boot. He unites them in himself, but they dissolve him, so that he is really nothing more than a small basin hollowed out by many streamlets that trickle into it and drain out of it again, to join other such rills and filling some other basin, which is why every inhabitant of the earth also has a 10th character that is nothing else than the passive fantasy of spaces yet unfulfilled. This permits a person all but one thing: to take seriously what his at least 9 other characters do and what happens to them. In other words, it prevents precisely what should be his true fulfillment. This interior space, admittedly hard to describe, is of a different shade and shape in Italy from what it is in England, because everything that stands out in relief against it is of a different shade and shape, and yet it is in both places the same: an empty, invisible space, with reality standing inside it like a child's toy town deserted by the imagination. Insofar as this can become visible to all eyes, it had happened in Caconia, making Caconia, unbeknownst to the world, the most progressive state of all, a state just barely able to go along with itself. One enjoyed a negative freedom there, always in the sense of insufficient grounds for one's own existence, and lapped around by the great fantasy of all that had not happened, or at least not yet happened, irrevocably as by the breath of those oceans from which mankind had once emerged. Events that might be regarded as momentous elsewhere were introduced with a casual "es ist passiert," a particular form of "it happened," unknown elsewhere in German or any other language, whose breath could transform facts and blows of fate into something as light as thistledown or thought. Perhaps despite so much that can be said against it, Caconia was, after all, a country for geniuses, which is probably what brought it to its ruin. Chapter 9. The first of 3 attempts to become a great man. This man who had returned could not remember any time in his life when he had not been fired with the will to become a great man. Fired up with a will to become a great man. It was a desire Ulrich seemed to have been born with. Such a dream may of course betray vanity and stupidity, but it is no less true that it is a fine and proper ambition without which probably would not be very many great men in the world. The trouble was that he knew neither how to become one nor what a great man is. In his school days his model had been Napoleon, partly because of the boy's natural admiration for the criminal and partly because his teachers had made a point of calling this tyrant who had tried to turn Europe upside down the greatest evildoer in history. This led directly to Ulrich's joining the cavalry as an ensign as soon as he was able to escape from school. The chances are that even then, had anyone asked him why he chose this profession, he would no longer have replied, in order to become a tyrant, unquote. But such wishes are Jesuits. Napoleon's genius began to develop only after he became a general. But how could Ulrich, as an ensign, have convinced his colonel that becoming a general was the necessary next step for him? Even at squadron drill, it seemed often enough that he and the colonel did not see eye to eye. Even so, Ulrich would not have cursed the parade ground, that peaceful common on which pretensions are undistinguishable from vocations. He had not been so ambitious. Pacifist euphemisms such as, quote, educating the people to bear arms meant nothing to him in those days. Instead, he surrendered himself to an impassioned nostalgia for heroic conditions of lordliness, power, and pride. He rode in steeplechases, fought duels, and recognized only 3 kinds of people: officers, women, and civilians, the last named a physically underdeveloped and spiritually contemptible class of humanity whose wives and daughters were the legitimate prey of army officers. He indulged in a splendid pessimism. It seemed to him that because the soldier's profession was a sharp, white-hot instrument, this instrument must be used to sear and cut the world for its salvation. As luck would have it, he came to no harm, but one day he made a discovery. At a social gathering, he had a slight misunderstanding with a noted financier, which Ulrich was going to clear up in his usual dashing style. But it turned out that there are men in civilian clothes also who know how to protect their women. The financier had a word with the war minister, whom he knew personally, and soon thereafter Ulrich had a lengthy interview with his colonel, in which the difference between an archduke and a simple officer was made clear to him. From then on, the profession of warrior lost its charm for him. He had expected to find himself on a stage of world-shaking adventures with himself as a hero, but now saw nothing but a drunkard young man shouting on wide empty square, answered only by the paving stones. When he realized this, he took his leave of his thankless career, in which he had just been made lieutenant, and quit the service. Chapter 10. The second attempt. Notes toward a morality for the man without qualities. But when Ulrich switched from the cavalry to civil engineering, he was merely swapping horses. The new horse had steel legs and ran 10 times faster. In Goethe's world, the clattering of looms was considered a disturbing noise. In Ulrich's time, people were just beginning to discover the music of machine shops, of steel hammers, and factory sirens. One must not believe that people were quick to notice that a skyscraper is bigger than a man on a horse. On the contrary, even today, those who want to make an impression will mount not a skyscraper, but a high horse. They are swift like the wind and sharp-sighted, not like a giant refractor, but like an eagle. Their feelings have not yet learned to make use of their intellect. The difference in development between these 2 faculties is almost as great as that between the vermiform appendix and the cerebral cortex. The difference in development between these 2 faculties is almost as great as that between the vermiform appendix and the cerebral cortex. So it was no slight advantage to realize, as Ulrich did when barely out of his teens, that a man's conduct with respect to what seemed to him the higher things in life is far more old-fashioned than his machines are. From the moment Ulrich set foot in engineering school, he was feverishly partisan. Who still needed the Apollo Belvedere when he had the new forms of turbodynamo or the rhythm movements of the steam engine's pistons before his eyes? Who could still be captivated by the 1,000 years of chatter about the meaning of good and evil when it turns out that they are not constants at all but functional values, so that the goodness of works depends on historical circumstances, while human goodness depends on the psychotechnical skills with which people's qualities are exploited? Looked at from a technical point of view, the world is simply ridiculous, impractical in all that concerns human relations, and extremely uneconomic and imprecise in its methods. Anyone accustomed to solving his problems with a slide rule cannot take seriously a good half of the assertions people make. The slide rule is two systems of numbers and lines combined with incredible ingenuity. The slide rule is two white enamel sticks of flat trapezoidal cross sections that glide past each other, and with whose help the most complex problems can be solved in an instant without needlessly losing a thought. The slide rule is a small symbol carried in one's breast pocket and sensed as a hard white line over one's heart. If you own a slide rule and someone comes along with big statements or great emotions, you say, "Just a moment, please. Let's first work out the margin for error and the most probable values." This was without a doubt a powerful view of what it meant to be an engineer. This was without a doubt a powerful view of what it meant to be an engineer. It could serve as the frame for a charming future self-portrait, showing a man with resolute features, a shag pipe clenched between his teeth, a tweed cap on his head, traveling in superb riding boots between Cape Town and Canada, on daring missions for his business. Between trips, there would always be time to draw on his technical knowledge for advice on world organization and management, or time to reformulate aphorisms like the one by Emerson that ought to hang over every workbench. Every workbench. Mankind walks the earth as a prophecy of the future, and all its deeds are tests and experiments, for every deed can be surpassed by the next. Actually, Ulrich had written this himself, putting together several Emerson's pronouncements together. It is hard to say why engineers don't quite live up to this vision. Why, for instance, do they so often wear a watch chain slung on a steep, lopsided curve from the vest pocket to a button higher up, or across the stomach in one high and two low loops, as if it were metrical foot in a poem? Why do they favor tie pins topped with stag's teeth or tiny horseshoes? Why do they wear suits constructed like the early stages of the automobile? And why, finally, do they never speak of anything but their profession? Or if they do speak of something else, why do they have that particular stiff, remote, superficial manner that never goes deeper inside than the epiglottis? Of course, this is not true of all of them. Far from it, but it is true of many, and it was true of all those Ulrich met the first time he went to work in a factory office. And it was true of those he met the second time. They all turned out to be men firmly tied to their drawing boards, who loved their profession and were wonderfully efficient at it. But any suggestion that they might apply their daring ideas to themselves instead of their machines would have been taken them aback, much as if they had been asked to use a hammer for the unnatural purpose of killing a man. And so Ulrich's second and more mature attempt to become a man of stature by way of technology quickly came to an end. Chapter 11, the most important attempt of all. Thinking over his time up to that point today, Ulrich might shake his head in wonder, as if someone were to tell him about his previous incarnations, but his third effort was different. An engineer may understandably become absorbed in his speciality instead of giving himself up to the freedom and vastness of the world of thought, even though his machines are delivered to the ends of the earth, for he is no more called upon to adapt the daring and innovative soul of his technology to his private soul than a machine can be expected to apply to itself the differential calculus upon which it is based. But the same cannot be said of mathematics, which is the new method of thought itself, the mind itself, the very wellspring of the times and the primal source of incredible transformation. It is the fulfillment of man's primordial dreams to be able to fly, travel with the fish, drill our way beneath the bodies of towering mountains, send messages with godlike speed, see the invisible and hear the distant speak, hear the voices of the dead, be miraculously cured while asleep, see with our own eyes how we will look 20 years after our death, learn in flickering nights thousands of things above and below this earth no one ever knew before. If light, warmth, power, pleasure, comforts are man's primordial dreams, then present-day research is not only science, but sorcery, spells woven from the highest powers of heart and brain, forcing God to open one fold after another of his cloak, a religion whose dogma is permeated and sustained by the hard, courageous, flexible, razor-cold, razor-keen logic of mathematics. Of course, there is no denying that all these primordial dreams appear, in the opinion of non-mathematicians, to have been suddenly realized in a form quite different from the original fantasy. Baron Munchausen's post-horn was more beautiful than our canned music, the 7-league boots more beautiful than a car, Oberon's kingdom lovelier than a railway tunnel, the magic root of the mandrake better than the telegraphed image, eating of one's mother's heart and then understanding birds more beautiful than the ethological study of a bird's vocalizing. We have gained reality and lost dream. No more lounging under a tree and peering at the sky between one's big and second toes. There's work to be done. To be efficient, one cannot be hungry and dreamy, but must eat steak and keep moving. It is exactly as though the old inefficient breed of humanity had fallen asleep on the ant-hill and found, when the new breed awoke, that the ants had crept up into its bloodstream, making it move frantically ever since, and unable to shake off that rotten feeling of ant-like industry. There is really no need to belabor the point, since it is obvious to most of us these days that mathematics has taken possession, like a demon, of every aspect of our lives. Most of us may not believe in the story of a devil to whom one can sell one's soul, but those who must know something about the soul, considering that as clergymen, historians, and artists they draw a good income from it, all testify that the soul has been destroyed by mathematics, and that mathematics is the source of an evil intelligence, that while making man the lord of the earth has also made him the slave of his machines. The inner drought, the dreadful blend of acuity in matters of detail and indifference toward the whole. Man's monstrous abandonment in a desert of details, his restlessness, malice, unsurpassed callousness, money-grubbing, coldness, and violence, all so characteristic of our times, are by these accounts solely the consequence of damage done to the soul by keen logical thinking. Even back when Ulrich first turned to mathematics, there were already those who predicted the collapse of European civilization because no human faith, no love, no simplicity, no goodness dwelt any longer in man. These people had all typically been poor mathematicians as young people and at school. This later put them in a position to prove that mathematics, the mother of all natural science and grandmother of technology, was also the primordial mother of the spirit that eventually gave rise to poison gas and warplanes. The only people who actually lived in ignorance of these dangers were the mathematicians themselves and their disciples, the scientists, whose souls were unaffected by all this, as if they were racing cyclists pedaling away for dear life, blind to everything in the world except the back wheel of the rider ahead of them. One thing on the other could safely be said about Ulrich. He loved mathematics because of the kind of people who could not endure it. He was in love with science, not so much on scientific as on human grounds. He saw that in all the problems that come within its orbit, science thinks differently from the laity. If we translate scientific outlook into view of life, hypothesis into attempt, and truth into action, then there would be no notable scientist or mathematician whose life work in courage and revolutionary impact did not far outmatch the greatest deeds in history. The man has not yet been born who could say to his followers, "You may steal, kill, fornicate. Our teaching is so strong that it will transform the cesspool of your sins into clear, sparkling mountain streams." But in science, it happens every few years that something till then held to be an error suddenly revolutionizes the field, or that dim and disdained idea becomes the ruler of a new realm of thought. Such events are not merely upheavals, but lead us upward like Jacob's ladder. The life of science is as strong and carefree and glorious as a fairy tale, and Ulrich felt, people simply don't realize it. They have no idea how much thinking can be done already. If they could be taught to think a new way, they would change their lives. Now it is a question of whether the world is so topsy-turvy that it always needs turning around. The world itself has always had twofold answer to this question. From the beginning of the world, most people, in their youth, have been in favor of turning the world around. They have always felt it was ridiculous the way their elders clung to convention and thought with the heart, a lump of flesh, instead of with the brain. To the young, the moral stupidity of their elders has always looked like the same inability to make connections that constitute ordinary intellectual stupidity, and their own natural morality had always been one of achievement, heroism, and change. But they have no sooner reached their years of accomplishment than they no longer remember this, and even less do they want to be reminded of it, which is why many of those for whom mathematics or science is a true profession are bound to disapprove of anyone taking up science for reasons such as Ulrich's. Nevertheless, experts judge his achievement in the third profession in a few years since he had taken it up to have been not inconsiderable. Nevertheless, experts judge his achievements in his third profession in the few years since he had taken it up to have been not inconsiderable. Chapter 12. The lady whose love Ulrich won after a conversation about sports and mysticism. It turned out that Bonadea too yearned for great ideas. Bonadea was the lady who had rescued Ulrich on the night of his ill-fated boxing match, and who had visited him the next morning shrouded in veils. He had baptized her Bonadea, the good goddess, for the way she had entered his life, and also after that goddess of chastity whose ancient temple in Rome had become, by an odd reversal of fate, the center for all the vices. For she did not know that story. She was pleased at the euphonious nickname Ulrich had conferred on her, and wore it on her visits to him as if it were a sumptuously embroidered house dress. "Am I really your good goddess?" she asked. "Your own Bona Dea?" And the correct pronunciation of these two words demanded that she throw her arms round his neck and lift her face up to his with a gaze full of feeling. She was the wife of a prominent man and the fond mother of two handsome boys. Her favorite phrase was highly respectable, applied to people, messengers, shops, and feelings, and she wanted to praise them. She could utter the words truth, goodness, and beauty as often and casually as someone else might say Thursday. Her intellectual needs were most deeply satisfied by her concept of a peaceful, idyllic life in the bosom of her family, its radiant happiness toned down to a gentle lamplight by the hovering presence far beneath the dark realm of "lead me not into temptation." She had only one fault. She could become inordinately aroused at the mere sight of a man. She was not lustful. She was sensual, as other people have other afflictions. For instance, suffering from sweaty hands or blushing too readily. It was something she had apparently been born with and could never do anything to curb. Meeting Ulrich in circumstances so like a novel, so firing to the imagination, she had been destined from the first moment to fall prey to a passion that began as sympathy, then led, after a brief though intense inner struggle, to forbidden intimacies, and continued as a seesaw between pangs of sinful desire and pangs of remorse. But Ulrich was only the most recent of God knows how many men in her life. Once they have caught on, men tend to treat such nymphomaniac women no better than morons for whom the cheapest tricks are good enough, and who can be tripped up in the same way time and again. The tenderer feelings of male passion are something like the snarling of a jaguar over fresh meat. He doesn't like to be disturbed. Consequently, Bonadea often led a double life, like any other respectable citizen who, in the dark interstices of his consciousness, is a train robber. Whenever no one was holding her in his arms, this quiet, regal woman in his arms, whenever no one was holding her in his arms, this quiet, regal woman was oppressed by self-hatred for the lies and humiliations she had to risk in order to be held in someone's arms. When her senses were aroused, she was subdued and gentle. Her blend of rapture and tears, crude directness, shadowed by predictable remorse, mania bolting in panic from the lurking depression that threatened, heightened her attraction, arousing excitement, much like a ceaseless tattoo on a drum hung with black crepe. But between lapses, in her intervals of calm, in the remorse that made her aware of her helplessness, she was full of claims of respectability, and this made life for her far from simple. A man was expected to be truthful and kind, sympathetic toward every misfortune, devoted to the imperial house, respectful toward everything respected, and morally to conduct himself with all the delicacy of a visitor at a sickbed. Not that it made any difference if these expectations were disappointed. To justify her conduct, she made up a tale of how her husband had caused her unfortunate condition in the innocent early years of their marriage. This husband, considerably older and physically bigger than she, was cast as a ruthless monster in the sad, portentous account she gave to Ulrich during the very first hours of their new love. It was some time afterward that he discovered that the man was a well-known and respected judge of high professional competence, who had also given the form of haunting that consists in the harmless gunning down of wild game, a welcome figure at various pubs and clubs frequented by hunters and lawyers, where male topics rather than art or love were the subject of conversation. The only failings of this rather unaffected, good-natured, and jovial man was that he was married to his wife, so that he found himself more often than other men engaged with her in what is referred to in the language of the law courts as a casual encounter. The psychological effect of submitting for years to a man she had married from motives of the head rather than the heart had fostered in Bonadea the illusion that she was physically overexcitable, and fantasy made it almost independent of her consciousness. She was chained to this man, so favored by circumstance, by some compulsion she could not fathom. She despised him for her own spinelessness, and felt spineless in order to despise him. She was unfaithful to him as a means of escape, but always chose the most awkward moments to speak of him or of their children. She was never able to let go of him completely. Like many unhappy wives, she ended up with an attitude, in an otherwise rather unstable personal environment, determined by resentment of her solidly rooted husband, and she carried her conflict with him into every new experience that was supposed to free her from him. What could a man do to silence her lamentations but transport her with all possible speed from the depressive to the manic state? She would promptly charge the doer of this deed with taking advantage of her weakness and being devoid of all the finer sensibilities. But her affliction laid a veil of moist tenderness over her eyes when she, as she put it with scientific detachment, inclined to this man. Chapter 13. A racehorse of genius crystallizes the recognition of being a man without qualities. It is not immaterial that Ulrich could say to himself that he had accomplished something in his field. His work had in fact brought him recognition. Admiration would have been too much to ask. For even in the realm of truth, admiration is reserved for older scholars on whom it depends whether or not one gets that professorship or professorial chair. Strictly speaking, he had remained promising, quote, promising, which is what in the Republic of Learning they call the Republicans. That is, those who imagine that they should give all their energies to their work rather than reserve a large part of them for getting ahead. They're promising, that is, which is what in the Republic of Learning they call the Republicans. That is, those who imagine that they should give all their energies to their work rather than reserved of a large part of their energy for getting ahead. They forget that individual achievement is limited, while on the other hand, everybody wants to get ahead. And they neglect the social duty of climbing, which means beginning as a climber so as to become in turn a prop and stay to others to climb up on their way. And one day, Ulrich stopped wanting to be promising. Ulrich stopped wanting to be promising. The time had come when people were starting to speak of genius on the soccer field or in the boxing ring, although there would still be at most only one genius of a halfback or a great tennis court tactician for every 10 or so explorers, tenors, or writers of genius who cropped up in the papers. The new spirit was not quite sure of itself. But just then Ulrich suddenly read somewhere, like a premonitory breath of ripening summer, the expression, the racehorse of genius. It stood in the report of a sensational racing success, and the author was probably not aware of the full magnitude of the inspiration his pen owed to the communal spirit. But Ulrich instantly grasped the fateful connection between his entire career and this genius among the racehorses. For the horse has, of course, always been sacred to the cavalry, and as a youth Ulrich had hardly ever heard talk in the barracks of anything but horses and women. He had fled from this to become a great man, only to find that when, as the result of his varied exertions, he perhaps could have felt within his reach, the horse had beaten him to it. No doubt this had a certain temporal justification, since it is not so very long ago that our idea of an admirable masculine spirit was exemplified by a person whose courage was moral courage, whose strength was the strength of conviction, and whose steadfastness was of the heart and a virtue, and who regarded speech as childish, fainting as not permissible, and agility and verve as contrary to dignity. Ultimately, no such person could be found alive except on the faculty of prep schools and in all sorts of literary pronouncements. He had become an ideological phantasm. To repeat, no doubt this has a certain temporal justification, since it is not so very long ago that our idea of an admirable masculine spirit was exemplified by a person whose courage was moral courage, whose strength was the strength of a conviction, whose steadfastness was of the heart and of virtue, and who regarded speed as childish, fainting as not permissible, and agility and verve as contrary to dignity. Ultimately, no such person could be found alive, except on the faculty of prep schools and in all sorts of literary pronouncements. He had become an ideological phantasm, and life had to seek a new image of manliness. As it looked around, it found that the tricks and dodges of an inventive mind working on logical calculations do not really differ all that much from the fighting moves of a well-trained body. There is a general fighting ability that is made cold and calculating by obstacles and openings, whether one is trained to search out the vulnerable spot in a problem or in a bodily opponent. The psychotechnical analysis of a great thinker and a champion boxer would probably show their cunning, courage, precision, and technique, and the speed of their reactions in their respective fields to be the same. It is probably a safe assumption that the qualities and skills by which they succeed do not differ from those of a famous steeplechaser, for one should never underestimate how many major qualities are brought into play in clearing a hedge. But on top of this, a horse and a boxer have an advantage over a great mind, in that their performance and rank can be objectively measured, so that the best of them is really acknowledged as the best. This is why sports and strictly objective criteria have deservedly come to the forefront, displacing such obsolete concepts as genius and human greatness. To repeat, but on top of this, a horse and a boxer had an advantage over a great mind in that their performance and rank can be objectively measured, so that the best of them is really acknowledged as the best. This is why sports and strictly objective criteria have deservedly come to the forefront, displacing such obsolete concepts as genius and human greatness. As for Ulrich, he must even be credited for being a few years ahead of his time on this point. He had conducted his scientific work in precisely this spirit of improving the record by a victory, an inch or a pound. He meant his mind to prove itself keen and strong, and it had performed the work of the strong. This pleasure in the power of the mind was a state of expectancy, a warlike game, a kind of vague, masterful claim on the future. What this power would enable him to accomplish was an open question. He could do everything with it or nothing, become a savior of mankind or a criminal. This is probably the nature of the mind that provides the world of machines and discoveries in constant flow of new supplies. Ulrich had regarded science as a preparation, a toughening, a kind of training. If it turned out that this way of thinking was too dry, hard, narrow, and blinkered, it would have to be accepted, like the grimace of extreme exertion and tension that show on the face when the body and the will are being pushed to great accomplishments. He had for years gladly endured spiritual hardship. He despised those who could not follow Nietzsche's dictum to let the soul starve for the truth's sake. Those who turn back, the faint-hearted, the soft-headed who comfort their souls with spiritual nonsense and feed it, because reason allegedly gives it stones instead of bread, on religious, metaphysical, fictitious pap, like rolls soaked in milk. It was his opinion that in this century, together with everything human, one was an expedition which required as a matter of pride that one cut off all useless questions with a, quote, not yet, and that life be conducted on a provisional basis, but with awareness of the goal to be reached by those who will come after. The fact is, science has developed a concept of hard, sober intelligence that makes the old metaphysical and moral ideas of the human race simply intolerable, even though all it has to put in their place is the hope that a distant day will come when a race of intellectual conquerors will descend into the valleys of spiritual fruitfulness. But this works only so long as the eye is not forced to abandon visionary distance for present nearness. But this works only so long as the eye is not forced to abandon visionary distance for present nearness, or made to read a statement that in the meantime a racehorse has to become a genius. The next morning Ulrich got out of bed on his left foot and fished half-heartedly for his slipper with his right. That had been in another city and street from where he was now, but only a few weeks ago. That had been in another city and street from where he was now, not only a few weeks ago. On the brown, gleaming asphalt under his windows, cars were already speeding past. The pure morning air was filling up with the sourness of the day, and the milky light filtered through the curtains. It seemed to him unspeakably absurd to start bending his naked body forward and backward as usual, to strain his abdominal muscles, to push it off the ground and lower it again, and finally batter away at a punching bag with his fist, as so many people do at this hour before going to the office. 1 hour daily is a twelfth of a day's conscious life. enough to keep a trained body in the condition of a panther alert for any adventure. But this hour is sacrificed for senseless expectation, because the adventures worthy of such preparation never come along. The same is true of love, for which people get prepared in the most monstrous fashion. Finally, Ulrich realized that even in science he was like a man who has climbed one mountain range after another without ever seeing a goal. He had now acquired bits and pieces of a new way to think and feel, but the glimpse of the new, so vivid at first, had been lost amid the ever-proliferating details, and if he had once thought that he was drinking from the fountain of life, he had now drained almost all his expectations to the last drop. At this point he quit, right in the middle of an important and promising piece of work. He now saw his colleagues partly as relentless, obsessive public prosecutors and security chiefs of logic, and partly as opium eaters, addicts of some strange pale drug that filled their world with visions of numbers and abstract relations. Quote, God help me, he thought. Quote, surely I never could have meant to spend all my life as a mathematician. But what had he really meant to do? At this point he could have turned only to philosophy, but the condition of philosophy found itself in at the time reminded him of the oxide being cut into strips in the story of Dido, even as it remained highly doubtful that these strips would ever measure out a kingdom. And what was new in philosophy resembled what he had been doing himself and held no attraction for him. All he could say was that he now felt further removed from what he had really wanted to be than he had in his youth, if indeed he had ever known what it was. With wonderful clarity he saw himself in all the abilities and qualities favored by his time, except for the ability to earn his living, which was not necessary, but he had lost the capacity to apply them. And since now that genius is attributed to soccer players and horses, a man can save himself only by the use he makes of genius. He resolved to take a year's leave of absence from his life in order to seek an appropriate application for his abilities.